Hey, welcome back to the third installment of Holiday Storytime at Fourth Wall Theater Company. I'm Philip.
And I'm Kim.
We are the co-artistic directors of Fourth Wall. We'd like to start by thanking our sponsor, the Liberty Group.
Yes, thank you, Liberty Group. And speaking of the Liberty Group, the Liberty Group is also our sponsor for another event happening in just 2 days from now on the 19th, which is our Holiday Cocktail Hour with Kim and Philip. It's a part of our year-end fundraising campaign, and we are so grateful for their sponsorship. So we hope that you'll put that on your calendars and you'll join us. It's going to be a lot of fun. There's going to be some special surprises, maybe some surprise guests. It's going to be a lot of fun. So please join us. And with that in mind, we hope that you'll keep all the theater companies and performing arts organizations in Houston in mind while you consider year-end giving if you're in the position to do so. It's an important thing that we all come out of this pandemic intact, and that we can bring live performance back to you when we're all past this. So please remember everybody in your holiday. Okay, now with that, enough of that. Let's get back
to some storytelling. These amazing artists and these stories that were new to us and we hope are new to you.
Yes. Thank you so much for joining us. Happy
holidays!
Hi, my name is Eboni Bell. Thank you so much for joining us. I am going to read Christmas at Red Butte by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Of course Santa will come, said Jimmy Martin confidently. Jimmy was 10, and at 10, it was easy to be confident. Why, he's got to come because it is Christmas Eve, and he always has come. You know that, twins. Yes, the twins knew it, and cheered by Jimmy's superior wisdom, their doubts passed away. There had been one terrible moment when Theodora had sighed and told them they mustn't be too much disappointed if Santa Claus did not come this year, because the crops had been poor, and he mightn't had enough presents to go around. That doesn't make any difference to Santa Claus, scoffed Jimmy. You know as well as I do, Theodora Prentice, that Santa Claus is rich whether the crops fail or not. They failed 3 years ago before Father died, but Santa Claus came all the same. Probably you don't remember it, twins, because you were too little, but I do. Of course he'll come, so you don't worry a mite, and he'll bring my skates and your dolls. He knows we're expecting them, Theodora, because we wrote him a letter last week and threw it up the chimney. And there'll be candy and nuts, of course, and Mother's gone to town to buy a turkey. I'll tell you, we're gonna have a rippin' Christmas. Well, don't use such slangy words about it, Jimmy boy, sighed Theodora. She couldn't bear to dampen their hopes any further, and perhaps Aunt Elizabeth might manage it if the colt sold well, but Theodora had her painful doubts. She sighed again as she looked out of the window far down the trail that would cross the prairie, red lighted by the declining sun of the short wintry afternoon. Do people always sigh like that when they get to be 16? Asked Jimmy curiously. You didn't sigh like that when you were only 15, Theodora. I wish you wouldn't. It makes me feel funny, and it's not a nice kind of funniness either. It's a bad habit I've got into lately, said Theodora, trying to laugh. Old folks are dull sometimes, you know, Jimmy boy. 16 is awfully old, said Jimmy reflectively. I'll tell you what I'm going to do when I'm 16, Theodora. I'm going to pay off the mortgage and buy a silk dress for Mother and a piano for the twins. Won't that be elegant? I hope you'll be a good, kind, brave man and a real help to your mother, said Theodora softly, sitting down before the cozy fire and lifting the fat little twins into her lap. Oh, I'll be good for her, never you fear, assured Jimmy, squatting comfortably down on the little fur rug before the stove, the skin of the coyote his father had killed 4 years ago. I believe in being good to your mother when you've only got the one. Now, tell us a story, Theodora. A real jolly story, you know, with lots of fighting in it. Only, please don't kill anybody. I like to hear about the fighting, but I like for all the people to come out alive. Theodora laughed and began a story which had the double merit of being true and exciting at the same time. It was quite dark when she finished, and the twins were nodding, but Jimmy's eyes were wide and sparkling. That's great, he said, drawing a long breath. Tell us another. No, it's time for bed for all of you, said Theodora firmly. One story is my rule, you know. But I want to sit up until Mother comes home, objected Jimmy. You can't. She may be very late. She would have to wait to see Mr. Porter. Besides, you don't know what time Santa Claus might come, if he comes at all. If he were to drive along and see you children up instead of being sound asleep in bed, he might go right on and never come at all. That argument was too much for Jimmy. All right, we'll go, but we have to hang up our stockings first. Twins, get yours. The twins toddled off in great excitement and brought back their Sunday stockings, which Jimmy proceeded to hang along the edge of the mantel shelf. This done, they all trooped obediently off to bed. Theodora gave another sigh and seated herself at the window, where she could watch the moonlit prairie for Mrs. Martin's homecoming and knit at the same time. I'm afraid that you will think that with all the sighing Theodora is doing, that she was a very melancholy and despondent young lady. You wouldn't think anything more unlike the real Theodora. She was the jolliest, bravest girl of 16 in all of Saskatchewan, as her shiny brown eyes and rosy dimpled cheeks would have told you, and her sighs were not on her own account, but simply for fear the children were going to be disappointed. She knew that they would be almost heartbroken if Santa did not come, and that it would hurt the patient, hard-working little mother more than anyone else. 5 years before this, Theodora had come to live with Uncle George and Aunt Elizabeth in a little log house at Red Butte. Her own mother had just died, and Theodora had only her big brother Donald left, and Donald had Klondike fever. The Martins were poor, but they had gladly made room for their little niece. Theodora had lived there ever since, her aunt's right-hand girl and the beloved playmate of the children. They had been very happy until Uncle George's death 2 years before this Christmas Eve. But since then, there had been hard times in the little log house, and though Mrs. Martin and Theodora did their best, it was woefully hard task to make both ends meet, especially this year with their crops having been poor. Theodora and her aunt had made every sacrifice possible for the children's sake, and at least Jimmy and the twins had not felt the pinch very severely yet. At 7, Mrs. Martin's bells jingled at the door, and Theodora flew out. "Go right in and get warm, Auntie," she said briskly. "I'll take Ned away and unharness him." "It's a bitter cold night," said Mrs. Martin wearily. There was a note of discouragement in her voice that struck dismay in Theodora's heart. "I'm afraid it means no Christmas for the children tomorrow," she thought sadly, as she led Ned away to the stable. When she returned to the kitchen, Mrs. Martin was sitting by the fire, her face in her chilled hand, sobbing convulsively. "Auntie, oh, Auntie, don't!" exclaimed Theodora impulsively. It was such a rare thing to see her plucky, resolute little aunt in tears. "You're cold and tired. I'll have a cup of tea for you in a thrice." "No, it isn't that," said Mrs. Martin brokenly. "It was seeing those stockings hanging there. Theodora, I couldn't get a thing for the children, not a single thing. Mr. Porter would only give us $40 for the colt, and when all the bills were paid, there was barely enough left for such necessities as we must have. I suppose I ought to feel thankful that we can get those. But the thought of the children's disappointment tomorrow is more than I can bear. It would have been better to have told them long ago, but I kept building on getting more for the colt. Well, it's weak and foolish to give away like this. We better both have a cup of tea and go to bed. It will save fuel." When Theodora went up to her little room, her face was very thoughtful. She took a small box from her table and carried it to the window. In it was a very pretty little gold locket hung on a narrow blue ribbon. Theodora held it tenderly in her fingers and looked out over the moonlight prairie with a very somber face. Could she give up her dear locket? The locket Donald had given her just before he started for the Klondike? She had never thought she could do such a thing. It was almost the only thing she had to remind her of Donald. Handsome, merry, impulsive, warm-hearted Donald, who had gone away 4 years ago with a smile on his bonny face and splendid hope in his heart. "Here's a locket for you, gift o' God," he had said gaily. He had such a dear, loving habit of calling her by the beautiful meaning of her name. A lump came into Theodora's throat as she remembered it. "I couldn't afford a chain too, but when I come back, I'll bring you a rope of Klondike nuggets for it." Then he had gone away. For 2 years, letters had come from him regularly, Then he wrote that he had joined a prospecting party to a remote wilderness. After that was silence, deepening into anguish of suspense that finally ended in hopelessness. A rumor came that Donald Prentice was dead. None had returned from the expedition he had joined. Theodora had long ago given up all hope of ever seeing Donald again, hence her locket was doubly dear to her. But Aunt Elizabeth had always been so good and loving and kind to her. Could she not make the sacrifice for her sake? Yes, she could, and she would. Theodora flung up her head in a gesture that meant decision. She took out of the locket the bit of hair, her mother's and Donald's, which it contained. Perhaps a tear or two fell as she did so, and then hastily donned her warmest cap and wraps. It was only 3 miles to Spencer. She could easily walk it in an hour, and as it was Christmas Eve, the shops would be open late. She must walk, for Ned could not be taken out again. The mare's foot was sore. Besides, Aunt Elizabeth must not know until it was done. As stealthily as if she were bound on some nefarious errand, Theodora slipped downstairs and out of the house. The next minute she was hurrying along the trail in the moonlight. The great dazzling prairie was around her, the mystery and splendor of the northern light all about her. It was very calm and cold. But Theodora walked so briskly that she kept warm. The trail from Red Butte to Spencer was a lonely one. Mr. Largan's house was halfway to town, and it was the only dwelling on it. When Theodora reached Spencer, she made her way at once to the only jewelry store the little town contained. Mr. Benson, its owner, had been a friend of her uncle's, and Theodora felt sure that he would buy her locket. Nevertheless, her heart beat quickly, and her breath came and went uncomfortably fast as she went in. Suppose he wouldn't buy it. Then there would be no Christmas for the children at Red Butte. "Good evening, Miss Theodora," said Mr. Benson briskly. "What can I do for you?" "I'm afraid I'm not a very welcome sort of customer, Mr. Benson," said Theodora with an uncertain smile. "I want to sell, not buy." Would you buy this locket?" Mr. Benson pursed his lips, took up the locket, and examined it. "Well, I don't often buy secondhand stuff," he said after some reflection, "but I don't mind obliging you, Miss Theodora. I'll give you $4 for this trinket." Theodora knew the locket had cost a great deal more than that, but $4 would get what she wanted, and she dared not ask for more. In a few minutes, the locket was in Mr. Benson's possession, and Theodora, with 4 crisp new dollar bills in her purse, was hurrying to the toy store. Half an hour later, she was on her way back to Red Butte with as many parcels as she could carry. Jimmy skates, 2 lovely dolls for the twins, packages of nuts and candy, and a nice plump turkey. Theodora beguiled her lonely tramp by picturing the children's joy in the morning. About a quarter of a mile past Mr. Largan's house, the trail curved suddenly about a bluff of poplars. As Theodora rounded the turn, she halted in amazement. Almost at her feet, the body of a man was laying across the road. He was clad in a big fur coat and had a fur cap pulled well down over his forehead. Almost all of him that could be seen was a full, bushy beard. Theodora had no idea who he was or where he had come from. But she realized that he was unconscious and that he would speedily freeze to death if help were not brought. The footprints of a horse galloping across the prairie suggested a fall and a runaway, but Theodora did not waste time in speculation. She ran back at full speed to Mr. Largan's house and roused the household. In a few moments, Mr. Largan and his son had hitched the horse to a wood sleigh and hurried down the trail to the unfortunate man. Theodora, knowing that her assistance was not needed and that she ought to get home quickly as possible, went on her way as soon as she had seen the stranger in safekeeping. When she reached the little log house, she crept in, cautiously put the children's gifts in their stockings, placed the turkey on the table where Aunt Elizabeth would see it first thing in the morning, and then slipped off to bed, a very weary but very happy girl. The joy that reigned in the little log house the next day was more than repayment for Theodora's sacrifice. "Whoopee! Didn't I tell you that Santa Claus would come all right?" shouted the delighted Jimmy. "Oh, what splendid skates!" The twins hugged their dolls in silent rapture, but Aunt Elizabeth's face was the best of all. Then The dinner had to be prepared, and everybody had a hand in that. Just as Theodora, after a grave peep into the oven, had announced that the turkey was done, a sleigh dashed around the house. Theodora flew to answer the knock at the door, and there stood Mr. Largan and a big, bewhiskered, fur-coated fella whom Theodora recognized as a stranger she had found on the trail. But was he a stranger? There was something oddly familiar in those merry brown eyes. Theodora felt herself grow dizzy. "Donald?" she gasped. "Oh, Donald!" And then she was in the big fella's arms, laughing and crying at the same time. Donald it was indeed. And then followed half an hour during which everybody talked at once, and the turkey would have been burned to a crisp had it not been for the presence of mind of Mr. Largan, who, being the least excited of them all, took it out of the oven and set it on the back of the stove. "To think that it was you last night and I never dreamed it," exclaimed Theodora. "Oh, Donald, if I hadn't come to town." "I'd have frozen to death, I'm afraid," said Donald soberly. "I got into Spencer on the last train last night. I felt that I must come right out. I couldn't wait till morning, but there wasn't a team to be got for love or money. It was Christmas Eve, so I came on horseback. Just by that bluff, something frightened my horse and she shied violently. I was half asleep and thinking of my little sister, and I went off like a shot. I suppose I struck my head against a tree. Anyway, I knew nothing more until I came into Mr. Largan's kitchen. I wasn't much hurt, felt none the worse of it except for a sore head and shoulder, but oh, gift of God, how you have grown. I can't realize that you're my little sister I left 4 years ago. I suppose you have been thinking I was dead. Well, I went way up north with a prospecting party. We had a tough time the first year, I can tell you, and some of us never came back. We weren't in a country where post offices were lying round loose either, you see. Then at last, just as we were about to give up in despair, we struck it rich. I brought a snug little pile home with me, and things are going to look up in this log house gift, oh God. There will be no more worrying for you, dear people, over mortgages. I'm so glad for Auntie's sake, said Theodora with shining eyes. But Donald, it's best of all just to have you back. I'm so perfectly happy that I don't know what to do or say. Well, I think you might have dinner, said Jimmy in an injured tone. The turkey's getting stone cold and I'm most starving. I just can't stand it another minute. So, with a laugh, they all sat down to the table and ate the merriest Christmas dinner the little log house had ever known. The end.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us. My name is Courtney Lomelo, and I will be reading to you The Christmas Present by Richmal Crompton. So sit back, relax, and snuggle up and get your hot cocoa. Mary Clay looked out the window of the old farmhouse. The view was dreary enough. Hill and field and woodland, bare, colorless, mist-covered, with no other house in sight. She had never been a woman to crave for company. She liked sewing. She was passionately fond of reading. She was not fond of talking. Probably she could have been very happy at Crom Farm, alone. Before her marriage, she had looked forward to the long evenings with her sewing and reading. She knew that she would be busy enough in the day, for the farmhouse was old and rambling, and she was to have no help in the housework. But she looked forward to quiet, peaceful, lamplit evenings, and only lately, after 10 years of married life, had she reluctantly given up hope of them. For peace was far enough from the old farm kitchen in the evening. It was driven away by John Clay's loud voice, raised always in orders or complaints or in the stumbling, incoherent reading aloud of his newspaper. Mary was a silent woman herself and a lover of silence, but John liked to hear the sound of his own voice. He liked to shout at her, to call for her from one room to another, and above all, he liked to hear his voice reading the paper out loud to her in the evening. She dreaded that most of all. It had lately seemed to jar on her nerves till she felt she must scream aloud. His voice going on and on, raucous and sing-song, became unspeakably irritating. His "Mary!" summoning her from her household work to wherever he happened to be, his Get my slippers, or bring me my pipe. Exasperated her almost to the point of rebellion. Get your own slippers had trembled on her lips, but had never passed them, for she was a woman who could not bear anger. Noise of any kind appalled her. She had borne it for 10 years, so surely she could get on with it. Yet today, as she gazed hopelessly at the wintry countryside, she became acutely conscious that she could not go on with it. Something must happen, yet what was there that could happen? It was Christmas next week. She smiled ironically at the thought. Then she noticed the figure of her husband coming up the road. He came in at the gate and roused the side of the door. "Mary!" She went slowly in answer to the summons. He held a letter in his hand. "Met the postman," he said. "From your aunt." She opened the letter and read it in silence. Both of them knew quite well what it contained. "She wants us to go over for Christmas again," said Mary. He began to grumble. "She's deaf as a post. She's most as deaf as a mother was. She ought to know better than to ask folks over when she can't hear a word anyone says." Mary said nothing. He always grumbled about the invitation at first, but really he wanted to go. He liked to talk to her uncle. He liked the change of going down to the village for a few days and hearing all of its gossip. He could quite well leave the farm to the hands for that time. The Crew deafness was proverbial. Mary's great-grandmother had gone stone deaf at the age of 35. Her daughter had inherited the affliction, and her granddaughter, the aunt with whom Mary had spent her childhood, had inherited it also at exactly the same age. "All right," he said at last, grudgingly, as though in answer to her silence. "We'd better go. Write and say we'll go." It was Christmas Eve. They were in the kitchen of her uncle's farmhouse. The deaf old woman sat in her chair by the fire knitting. Upon her sunken face there was a curious, sardonic smile that was her habitual expression. The two men stood in the doorway. Mary sat at the table looking aimlessly out the window. Outside, the snow fell in blinding showers. Inside, the fire gleamed on the copper pots and pans, the crockery on the old oak dresser, the hams hanging from the ceiling. Suddenly, James turned. "Jane!" he said. The deaf woman never stirred. "Jane!" Still, there was no response upon the enigmatic old face by the fireside. "Jane!" She turned slightly toward the voice. "Get them photos from upstairs to show John," he bawled. "Oh, what about boats?" she said. "Photos," roared her husband. "Coats?" she quivered. Mary looked from one to the other. The man made a gesture of irritation and went from the room. He came back with a pile of picture postcards in his hand. "It's quicker to do a thing oneself," he grumbled. "They're what my brother sent from Switzerland, where he's working now. It's a fine land, to judge from the views of it." John took them from his hand. "She gets worse?" he said, nodding toward the old woman. She was sitting, gazing at her fire, her lip curved in the curious smile. Her husband shrugged his shoulders. "Aye, she's nigh as bad as her mother was, and her grandmother. Aye, it takes her it takes longer to tell her to do something than to do it myself. And deaf folks get a bit stupid, too. Can't see what you mean. They're best let alone." The other man nodded and lit his pipe. Then James opened the door. "The snow stopped," he said. "Shall we go to the end of the village and back?" The other nodded, took his cap from behind the door. A gust of cold air filled the room as they went out. Mary took a paper-backed book from the table and came over to the fireplace. "Mary!" She started. It was not the sharp, querulous voice of the deaf old woman. It was more like the voice of the young aunt whom Mary remembered in her childhood. The old woman was leaning forward, looking at her intently. "Mary, a happy Christmas to 'ee." And as if in spite of herself, Mary answered in her ordinary low tones, "The same to you, Auntie." "Thank ye, thank ye." Mary gasped. "Aunt, can you hear me speaking like this?" The old woman laughed, silently, rocking to and fro in her chair as if with pent-up merriment of the years. "Yes, I can hear 'ee, child. I've always heard 'ee." Mary clasped her hands eagerly. "Then, you're cured, Aunt." I'm cured, as far as there was ever anything to be cured. I was never deaf, child, nor never will be, please God. I took you all in fine." Mary stood up in bewilderment. "You? Never deaf?" The old woman chuckled again. "Oh, nor my mother, nor her mother neither." Mary shrank back from her. I don't know what you mean," she said unsteadily. "Have you been pretending?" "I'll make you a Christmas present of it, dearie," said the old woman. "My mother made me a Christmas present of it when I was your age, and her mother made her one. I haven't a lass of my own to give it to, so I'll give it to you. It can come on quite sudden-like if you want it, and then you can hear what you choose and not hear what you choose. Do you see?" She leaned nearer and whispered, "You shut out all of it, of having to fetch and carry for 'em, answer their daft questions, and run their errands like a dog. I've watched you, my lass. You don't get much peace, do you?" Mary was trembling. "Oh, I don't know what to think," she said. I couldn't do it." "Do what you like," said the old woman. "Take it as a present anyways. The crude deafness for a Christmas present," she chuckled. "Use it or not as you like. You'll find it main amusing anyways." And into the old face there came again that curious smile, as if she carried in her heart some jest fit for the gods of Olympus. The door opened suddenly with another gust of cold air, and the two men came in again, covered with white snow. I'll not do it," whispered Mary, trembling. "We didn't get far. It's coming on again," remarked John, hanging up his cap. The old woman rose and began to lay the supper, silently and deftly, moving from cupboard to table without looking up. Mary sat by the fire, motionless and speechless, her eyes fixed on the glowing coals. "Any signs of the deafness in her?" whispered James, looking towards Mary. "It come on my wife when she was just that age." Yes, so I've heard." And then he said loudly, "Mary!" A faint pink color came into her cheeks, but she did not show by look or movement that she had heard. James looked significantly at her husband. The old woman stood still for a minute, with a cup in each hand, and then smiled, her slow, subtle smile. The end.
Okay, Courtney, that's great. Thanks. Courtney, that's all. Kaylin, can you hear me? I don't think Courtney can hear me.
Hey, Courtney. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaylin.
Happy holidays. I wonder if Mrs. Claus is deaf or if someone read that story to her. I am somewhat long-winded. Oh well, food for thought. What fun we had tonight. Laughter is the best medicine. Thank you for joining us. We only have one more episode left of Holiday Storytime, Christmas Eve, my favorite and busiest time of the year, but I will be here to see my friends at Fourth Wall Theater Company and hear these amazing stories with you. Thank you again to the Liberty Group for this amazing gift of Holiday Storytime. If you've enjoyed these stories, please remember that Fourth Wall Theater Company is in their annual giving campaign right now. And so if you're able and so inclined, please go online to fourthwalltheaterco.com and make a donation to help keep them going. Remember, I know who's naughty and nice, and I promise that a donation to Fourth Wall Theater Company will put you on my nice list. Well, good night, and we'll see you next week, Christmas Eve, for more holiday story time. Ho, 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 ho.